Thank you very much. And thank you for the organizers of this session, and I really appreciate being invited. A fundamental hypothesis in the study of Edomite history since the 1960s has been that the polity initially formed in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE in the context of Assyrian imperial expansion. That plot line of the origin of the polity of Edom has become a point of controversy in recent years. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that some tribal elements of groups that exploited the Wadi Fanan copper mines moved east, worked with other tribes, and eventually participated in the establishment of a Butsera center polity known as Edom. But the view that Edom, as the Butsera polity, was founded in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, during the florescence of the expansion of the Assyrian Empire that has dominated the field until recently, continues to explain the Butsera polity, although the model must be more nuanced and flexible to incorporate new evidence. I will argue today that an important way to strengthen our understanding of the role of the Assyrians in the growth of the Edomite polity is to place that process within the context of social and political developments on the frontiers of comparable empires. Expanding territorial empires, like the Assyrians, dramatically affect the regions that they occupy and influence. The theoretical comparative study of empires has grown in recent years, and the methods and findings of this research influence the study of ancient Near Eastern empires, including the Assyrian Empire and its territory of control. Ancient empires did not seek to control continuous spaces. Rather, as Richard Payne puts it, they aimed to disrupt pre-existing spatial orders in favor of an imperial order that actually operated through an archipelago of territories reorganized in their service. Ancient empires often adjusted their policies depending upon factors such as pre-existing political structures, natural resources, and strategic location. Although the processes and strategies of ancient empires are comparable, they each exhibit their own distinctive histories, administrative structures, ideologies, and imperial aspirations. Furthermore, they interacted with states and polities that also had distinctive histories. The aim of this presentation is to investigate the nature of Assyrian interactions with Edom by placing the strategies of that empire in the context of comparable imperial ventures. There are three spatial characteristics of ancient empires: imperial center, the domination of territory beyond its core provinces, and projection of its influence into a larger territorial context. The rulers of ancient states attempted to dominate an extensive territory through economic exchange, political control, reorganization of settlement, and patterns and the co-option of local elite. Economic exchange takes the form of tribute and taxes imposed on the provinces and tributaries, as well as exchange of products through trade. The imposition of tribute often results in increased agricultural output in the provinces and increased production of finished goods and raw materials. Political control takes the form of military conquests, which leads to the occupation of new territories and the intimidation of nearby polities. When occupation is the result, provincial governors construct an extensive infrastructure that includes provincial cities, garrisons, and roads. A reorganization of settlement is almost always discernible in the provinces of ancient empires, in the form of deportations of a portion of the indigenous population and forced nucleation. The process of moving rural people into towns and villages where they can be monitored and controlled. Rural villages or nomadic populations living in subjected territories may also move to more urban environments to take advantage of the new economic conditions. The imperial elite offered gifts and privileges to gain the support and cooperation of local leaders. This situation is visible in the emulation of imperial styles by local elite groups and the presence of imperial imports in local contexts. The leaders of ancient hegemonic and territorial empires also attempted to project their economic, political, and cultural influence into the larger context. All of these characteristics were present for the Assyrian Empire and helped to define its imperial policy in the southern Levant and in Edom in particular. Although there was not a coherent policy in the southern Levant, The Assyrian rulers did employ military strategies and political techniques that were similar to those used throughout the empire: deportation, invasion, and co-option of local elites. As a general method of operation, the Syrian kings focused on the extraction of tribute through the local polities in the southern Levant. Under the threat and use of force, the expectation of loyalty and support for Assyrian troops and officials stationed in the area. The Assyrian rulers concentrated on the Mediterranean coast and the outlets of the Arabian trade routes with the transport of lucrative and exotic products. Rebellious polities were defeated, and although it appears that the Assyrian rulers retained local leadership as the need arose, problematic regions were often reorganized into provinces, and Assyrian officials were installed over them. But even after Judah participated in a rebellion under Hezekiah, Sennacherib retained him as a local king after diminishing Hezekiah's capacity to revolt again. As long as these marginal polities paid tribute, remained loyal to Assyria, and did not interfere with the Assyrian economic interests, they were not attacked, and local elites were kept in key positions. The study of regions on the margins of imperial control highlight four aspects of society in which transformations often occur when the subordinate territory begins to interact with an empire. The changes, which are similar to those that occurred in Edom, include changes in political structure, intensification and diversification of settlement, economic changes, and the religious or ideological transformations. Today, I will focus on the first two of these transformations. Changes in local political structures were common transformations on the periphery of empires as smaller polities entered into the sphere of influence. There was usually an increase in political complexity, increased stratification, creation of elites, or increased disparity between elites and non-elites. But at other times, there's a decrease, or even a complete dismantling of the political structures. The leaders of empires often use strategies to incorporate areas into the imperial sphere, including direct control through the threat of force, asymmetrical alliances, clientage, and the dismantling of upper echelons of politically rebellious areas. The choice of the strategy of incorporation related to the resources available in a region and the proximity to the homeland, extant political complexity, and the threat posed by rebellious or antagonistic states. The various reactions to imperial expansion could result in dramatic changes in the material culture when resistance was significant. Notably, peripheral elite often chose a strategy of compromise and acquiescence to position themselves and their communities to take advantage of the new economic and social situations. When empires expand into regions characterized by tribal societies, a range of new political alignments could form when contact occurs. These changes include the construction of lineages with permanent leaders, but no super-tribal organization, the dismantling of super-tribal confederations, and the formation of moderately centralized tribal states. Although there are numerous other possibilities, tribal societies often begin to develop new forms of political leadership as they begin to interact with empires. Perhaps as a form of mimicry, most of these influenced societies established a royal hierarchy similar to that of the empire. If a remote polity did not pose a threat and had sufficient resources, rulers could depend on local leaders to organize and produce surpluses, a portion of which the rulers, would extract as tribute. In these instances, the local ruler was in a situation in which they had to maintain two relationships, one with the imperial administration and the other with the local population. Although no demands were placed on the local elite by the empire, the situation also provided new avenues of control within the community by which leaders could elevate themselves potentially or politically and economically. Indirect rule through a patron-client relationship was the most effective and cost-efficient method of integrating regions at the periphery of the imperial economy. In Edom, the Assyrian rulers chose to retain the local elite. When Assyria expanded into the southern Levant under Tiglath-Pileser III, the ruler in Edom was Kaus-Malak. A leader the Assyrians could intimidate or offer benefits to in order to extract tribute and control the territory. The Assyrians relied on these local rulers to deliver tribute and remain loyal. The Edomite rulers likely ruled through a combination of patronymial authority, power derived from family and tribal relationships, and charismatic authority, the ability to lead in collective organization and military prowess. These leaders needed to occupy the space between the empire, which invested its own authority to rule, between the empire and the communities, which would produce the surpluses necessary to maintain the polity and the requirements for tribute. It was in the best interest of the empire to maintain this economically efficient relationship in the following years because Edom did not border any rival states, and it surely did not pose a threat to the empire. The Edomite elite exploited that situation as the group who interacted with the imperial power. They used Assyrian-style ceramics, found predominantly at Butsera, and constructed monumental buildings with links to Assyrian building style, erected exclusively at Butsera. Their relationship with the empire also entailed a means to increase their own status, wealth, and power. Beyond the king of Edom, it is difficult to determine the local administrative organization and the extent of his control in the region. But these changes to a political structure do not happen in a vacuum. The need to interact with the empire combined with an elite desire to mimic that empire, or the empire that catalyzed these changes. Butsera was the center of elite activity and the residence of the Edomite kings mentioned in Assyrian sources. It was the largest Edomite settlement and the only large site with a fortification wall. Butsera incorporated an acropolis that was physically separated from the domestic dwelling by a retaining wall and a 2-meter high podium. The buildings on the acropolis, the Area A Temple and the Area C Palace, both illustrate elite attempts to emulate the designs of Assyrian buildings and replicate the spectacle of sovereignty. The high concentration of Assyrian-style pottery and artifacts at Butsera also attests to the elite status of its residents. Certainly, there were officials subservient to the king. Khalsanah and Malak Baal are 2 attested officials. But there's little evidence of elite houses, burials, or a developed bureaucratic system. Of course, more excavation of the domestic areas could reveal such a system. Indeed, it is unclear if the ruler was even able to extend their authority much beyond Butsera and its hinterland. The agricultural areas in the Wadi al-Hassa, north of Butsera, are characterized by small villages with some storage capacity, perhaps to support Butsera. The Wadi Musa region around Petra did not have any administrative villages, and there is not much evidence of attempts to control that region. The 7th century BCE mountaintop sites in the Wadi Musa area could have served as locations of resistance, or they could have been very loosely affiliated with the Butsera leadership. This could be an example of what James Osborne labeled malleable territoriality, in which the ruling group exerts power inconsistently across the extent of its territory. A ruler's relationship to the territory they control is a dynamic one. A dynamic one that changes over time and varies across the landscape. Combined with the idea of malleable territoriality, the theory of polycentrism to analyze territories with multiple types and centers of authority could help explain the relationship between Butsera and the mountaintop settlements. As settlements expand into recently conquered regions, those regions often undergo an intensification of settlement and shifts in the patterns of occupation. There's typically an increase in the quantity of sites and a diversification of site types as new settlements are established with specialized functions. This diversification of site types is related to the need for agricultural expansion and increased access to resources. In addition to settlement intensification, there's often a nucleation of settlement around the centers that were controlled by the elite. This preference for settlement near larger centers is reinforced by compliant local elite who need to supply tribute and maintain security. In regions where the imperial power does not annex or directly rule, the nucleation and density of settlement usually clusters around sites where the regional elite reside because of the increased need for labor and the benefits provided by the new economic situation. This process is also visible along the upper Tigris River, where a high number of newly established sites were clustered around the seasonal stream. 3 large villages were expanded and functioned as regional centers. After the Assyrians there established Tushan as a provincial center near its northern frontier, the imperial administrators actively promoted the settlement of semi-nomadic groups and emphasized the transition to more agrarian lifestyles. In Edom, most settlements in the highlands were established during the period when Assyria was most actively involved in the affairs of the southern Levant. Butsera was possibly founded in its location because of its proximity to trade routes and to the comparatively fertile Wadi valleys to the north and northeast. The major north-south trade route was accessible to the east of the settlement and along the Wadi Dahal through the mountainous regions to the Wadi Arba and then to the Beersheba Valley, passed nearby. As in some other imperial situations, there was a diversification of settlement in Edom. To the west of Butsera was the copper mining district along the Wadis Khalid, Dana, and Al Jiara. In the Wadi Al Hassa, its tributaries, numerous small agricultural sites were constructed during this period. While the precise role of the elite in the expansion of the agricultural activities is unclear, modest settlements like Arik, Kirbat Al Buras, and Kirbat Al Gubana all have structures and are some of the largest settlements dating to this period in Edom. Notably, these sites have only been surveyed, so their precise function is not yet clear. Like in other imperial marginal situations, the one administrative and palatial center is surrounded by much smaller villages and agricultural sites, not a settlement hierarchy that would be expected for chiefdoms or states. In conclusion, using these theories and analysis from comparative empires can nuance several areas of Edomite history and the discussion of political complexity in the Iron Age Southern Levant. First, settlement patterns changed on the edge of the Assyrian Empire. As the empire began to demand more tribute and support, the Edomite leaders were forced to acquire those resources. Agricultural sites in the more fertile wadis surrounding Butsera were employed to increase production in the arid environment. Settlements and observation sites expanded along the routes where lucrative products from the Arabian transport or trade was transported. Mountaintop settlements were founded in the rugged mountains near the Wadi Musa, sites that were isolated and possibly outside the authority of the kings of Edom living in Butsera. Second, Edomite elite employed symbols of authority that displayed their relationship to the empire. Buildings were constructed exclusively at the central Edomite site of Butsera, with symbolic and architectural links to the empire. The palatial building and temple in the raised area of the walled compound set the Edomite elite apart as those who maintained symbolic and political connections to the Assyrian power brokers. These were likely the same Edomites who used the Assyrian palaceware in their ceremonies and at their feasts. Third, the Edomite elite exerted uneven authority over their extended territory. This state of malleable territoriality could have been the result of their inability to maintain acquiescence from competing or oppositional tribes in other regions of Edom. There may have been attempts to control the difficult terrain within the Edomite highland, but the power and reach of the Butsera rulers was fragile within the society and exerted a power and exertion of power required considerable negotiation. Thank you very much.